Welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. I've been looking forward to this podcast for some time. Mickey Edwards is a legendary figure in the conservative movement. He represented Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District in Congress for 16 years. He was a member of the Republican leadership in the House and chairman of the party's policy committee in the House of Representatives. And beyond that, he was an early chairman of the organization that ran CPAC. The American Conservative Union, also one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation. Any history of the conservative movement has to include Mickey Edwards. And yet Mickey Edwards is here on the Bulwark podcast. Mickey, good to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Glad to be with you.
Well, I wanted to talk about a piece you wrote earlier this week after this weekend's podcast, Mugged by Reality. You wrote, as the chairman of CPAC during the rise of Ronald Reagan, I should have seen the grotesque display of this year's CPAC coming. I failed to do so. And as I mentioned right before we started the podcast, I have been wrestling with this as well. What did we miss? How did we not see it coming? Or did we see it coming? And did we just ignore it? And I think you have a somewhat different historical perspective. But let me just read the beginning of this piece in the Bulwark, which I strongly recommended. Several years ago, I was mugged and robbed as I took an early morning walk through Louis Armstrong Park in New Orleans. I should have been paying more attention, been more alert, but instead I was taken by surprise and had the bruises to show for it. That event came to mind as I watched this year's Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. If someone had told me 40 years ago that CPAC attendees would raucously cheer a United States senator bragging about his effort to overturn a presidential election, or brazenly worship a literal golden idol in the shape of a failed presidential candidate, I never would have believed them, but maybe I should have seen it coming. Yeah, no, I've thought about that for some time. So let's talk about this. And I want, most of our podcasts deal with current events, but I want to really do a deep dive into the history back into the 70s and the 1980s, because there were warning signs even back then that there was an element of the party that was headed off in a very different direction, weren't there?
Well, it was, and probably the most visible part of that was Pat Buchanan, and there had been the John Birch Society,
60s.
Yeah, but one of the things, so I talked about what happened at CPAC, but one of the things that really struck me, and I remember, so for 5 years, I think it was, I was the national chairman of the American Conservative Union. And the conservative movement had always been, conservative Republicans had always been about national defense, about not having taxes too high or too much regulation that we thought were harmful to the economy. But we were using a direct mail house of conservatives to do fundraising letters for ACU. And every time that they came with one, it was full of all of this new stuff about social issues, cultural issues. And I always just edited the stuff out when, put it back to the traditional values. But it didn't dawn on me. There's some people out here who are singing from a different songbook, but it just didn't really register. And then later, many years later, I wrote a book called Reclaiming Conservatism. This was, I think it came out in 2008 from Oxford University Press, and tracing how the conservative movement had changed. And when that happened, Charlie, I asked to go speak. My publisher wanted me to speak. I was doing talks all over the country, and they wanted me to go talk to the Heritage Foundation because I'd been one of their founders. And they said no. They said no, I couldn't go there. So I talked to Ed Fulner, who was head of. I helped found this organization. You can't tell me that I can't come talk about my book. So they relented, and I went. But here's what happened. A woman introduced me. She had worked for me at the ACU, the American Conservative Union. And because there was a pretty good sized crowd, And many of those people were not familiar with the Heritage Foundation. She started out by saying, well, let me tell you about the Heritage Foundation, and started going through the mission statement. Part of the mission statement was that preserving traditional social values. And I said, well, wait. And I helped write the mission statement. That wasn't in there. And I had checked, and I said, that stuff was added 20 years later. And
So the culture war stuff came a long time after the founding of these
it
organizations.
did.
This was
So
not central in the beginning.
it was not, but one of the things, for example, most of the conservatives, were arguing the pro-life position, and suddenly, because of partly of Henry Hyde, but also Chris Smith from New Jersey, uh, these issues, these social, cultural issues, including abortion, were brought up with whatever bill we were talking about. It was, if you talked about a defense bill, it was in there. Foreign aid, it was in there. If you talked about almost any issue, it would turn into the culture wars. And so, and that was while I was in the House. So, these things were beginning to show up in little bitty pieces here and there. And I guess I just thought, well, that's just Henry, or that's Chris, or that's, this direct mail house, or whatever. And it never occurred to me how big that movement was, and uh, how strong it was, and how unrelenting it was.
I've tried to explain this as well to folks, people who will say, "Well, it was always there, and you should have seen it, and you were blind." And I said, "Well, there's two things. Number one, you always recognized there was a recessive gene on the right. Whether it was the John Birch Society or the racists or the people who wanted to emphasize all the super cultural issues, but they were never dominant. And so it was okay to kind of look the other way, to kind of ignore them, like your uncle at Thanksgiving, and also." There was room for difference of opinion. You were not required to be an absolute lockstep on all of these issues. There was no cult of personality. I mean, conservatives liked Ronald Reagan, but there was no cult of personality like we have with Trump. So you could ignore, overlook some of the folks at the edge of the fever swamps, but also you weren't required to embrace them. Do you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I agree. And not only that, but a lot of the most prominent voices in conservatism actually were pushing back against that. For example, Bill Buckley at National Review was pushing back against things like the John Birch Society. And so even the conservative mainstream was saying this stuff is nutty. And that was dominant. So these things were fringe then, and somehow they have become over time the dominant force in the conservative forces.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit in history. You were active in Ronald Reagan's first campaign, well, his successful campaign, not his first campaign, his
Right,
successful campaign in 1980. So you were part of the Reagan world back in 1980.
right.
And you had supported him during the primary and during the general election. And if I remember correctly, at one time, the American Conservative Union, which runs CPAC, and this is going to strike some people as counterintuitive, was it was originally designed to kind of keep conservatism sane, wasn't it? One of the things was it was in the business of ideological hygiene, keeping the crackpots out. I mean, it became later the Star Wars bar scene, etc. But originally, it was very, very much mainstream conservatism.
Well, yeah, it was not only mainstream conservatism, but when Reagan was elected, and I was chairman of ACU, and we were the dominant force in putting on the Conservative Political Action Conference. I invited Reagan to speak, and he came, and we had the big ballroom at the Mayflower Hotel packed. Everybody, it was black tie. It was. Really, the top conservatives from around the country, and it wasn't crazy.
It was.
It was just traditional Republican conservative, stuff about again strong defense and keeping spending under control. It was that's all it was, and you could have. It could have been a meeting of the Chamber of Commerce. It could have been a meeting of almost any kind of a sane civic organization, but with a political point of view. It wasn't anything like this one where people were standing. It was amazing. People who proclaim their religious faith, but who were standing by a golden idol. The golden idol, was of Donald Trump. I mean, it was nothing like what we have seen for not just this year, but for the last 4 or 5 years.
So let's try to trace this line, how we got from there to here. And you mentioned direct mail. There's a character who I think a lot of people have forgotten in American politics, but was really, really central. Richard Vigory, who was this direct mail entrepreneur who was, as you point out, he was the guy that sent out the direct mail appeals for just about everybody on the right. Yeah, you used him at the American Conservative Union. And he was very powerful and very influential and was one of the people who kind of introduced these hot button, what we would call sort of internet meme type things, with the rhetoric going for the culture war references. And this was one of the moments where you started to see a different tone on the right. Just talk to me about Richard Vigory and his influence.
Well, Richard was he was an entrepreneur, but he was also an innovator. At that time, direct mail campaigning was not uh, all that popular, and so he had created this big operation with his company where almost every conservative candidate in the country, I was one of them, and conservative organizations, used Richard Vigory and for direct mail. And we did a lot of direct mail campaigning. Part of the deal with him was that we had to whatever money we raised through his direct mail had to be plowed back into more of his direct mail, which
Mm.
was then used, not just to raise money, but to campaign. And you campaigned by direct mail. And so he and a couple of the pollsters who were coming up, like Arthur Finkelstein and some others at the same
Mhm.
time, were really beginning to push candidates toward the right and toward more hardline campaigning. And again, I did my best. I was resisting it. I would change it, but they were becoming real powers in the conservative movement, and they were changing it because they had decided that it was the nastier stuff that was going to bring in the money, and they pursued that relentlessly.
Yeah, I mean, so conservatives had been focused, as you point out, on keeping taxes low, regulation within bounds, adequately funding national defense. Think values like prudence and skepticism in the face of proposals for sweeping overhauls. But this was being displaced by the new, social cultural warfare lines. I had forgotten that it was Vigory who assembled a group of folks that was to become the moral majority. So, I mean, the moral majority, the Christian Coalition, these became major forces on the right during the 1980s. And you write, again, new and narrower forces were coming to the fore. I still didn't see the larger displacement of traditional conservatism that was gaining steam.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I pointed out, so Richard Vigory had a meeting at his house in McLean, Virginia, and I was there, and uh, a lot of the leaders of the conservative movement were there, and but it was a very mixed bag. So it was Paul Weyrich, who was Greek Orthodox,
Hmm.
Howie Phillips, who's Jewish, I'm Jewish, and other and then Eddie McAteer, who worked for
Hmm.
a Christian organization. Uh, and so what came out of that, it was it was how can we get conservative people who are, in their own mindsets are conservatives, and they tend to be churchgoers or synagogue goers or whatever. How can we get them to focus on understanding that if you are of a conservative mindset, you ought to be voting Republican, not Democrat? And that's what it was for. And out of that, grew the moral majority. But as I pointed out in my article, Charlie, the moral majority was not about a religion. It was not about any one religion. And then the Christian coalition came along later, and it was very overtly and very narrowly targeted, and changed the dynamic a lot. And so, uh, this was the beginning, and I hadn't seen where it was going to go.
And then, of course, we had the rise of the entertainment wing of the Republican Party. And I always remind people that during the Reagan era, there was really no conservative talk radio. The Fairness Doctrine had not been repealed. When Ronald Reagan was president, there was no Fox News. There wasn't this huge infrastructure of a conservative ecosystem. So then we had the phenomenon of Newt Gingrich, who made politics into warfare, Rush Limbaugh, who was really the founder of the conservative ecosystem. Talk to me about how that changed conservative politics.
Well, I mean, I have talked in terms of Congress and what's changed to make Congress as dysfunctional as it is. That was largely Newt Gingrich. Newt gets attacked for being a conservative. Well, he is kind of in a crazy extreme way, but he's really more about just power. And he introduced a really negative, no holds barred and aggressive kind of campaigning, arguing that this was before he became speaker, as he rose through the ranks to become the Republican leader. And the idea was that it was nonstop political warfare. He used an organization that he was chairing to send material all over the country to political candidates on the right, about here's how to attack your opponent. Here are the names to call your opponent. And so he was aided by Rush Limbaugh, who echoed everything he said on the air. And there were also people in the press who promoted him. There was this Evans and Novak column that was very prominent then.
Huge back then. Back in the day.
Bob Novak, everything that Newt said, he echoed. And so Newt gets a lot of blame for the extreme turn that the right has taken.
And then, of course, as you point out, you had that nexus between Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh. I think it's interesting to remember that after Republicans took control of Congress back in 1994, the freshman class brought in Rush Limbaugh to speak. Of course, there's been a lot of reevaluations of Rush Limbaugh's contributions to the conservative movement. So what would your summary be, looking back on what role Rush Limbaugh played? I would argue that he really was the architect of the overthrow of the conservative movement's, shall we say, mainstream by the entertainment wing of the conservative movement. And that as a result, he made the conservative movement dumber, crueler, and softened the ground up for what we have right now with Donald Trump.
Well, I would say that Limbaugh was a forerunner of Fox News. That a long time ago there had been a person who had a show similar named Joe Pine, but it didn't have nearly the audience or resonance that Limbaugh did.
Right.
And by being so nasty, it was entertaining. It was entertaining. This is not the way people talked. And
he made nasty entertaining. I mean, that was one of the things he did. It was he made people developed a taste for that sort of thing.
Right. So things like the term the feminazis, right? And so people who had kind of a basic conservative instinct, which it was in many cases is not a pro anything philosophy. It's more an anti-liberal philosophy. It's anti the left, and he was using these uh, demonizing terms, but in a funny way. He was people
Yeah.
would tune in, and he built this huge audience, and the people who would listen to Limbaugh were not people who were okay, listen to Limbaugh, and then later you're going to turn on the news and you're going to hear what's Walter Cronkite got to say and all this stuff. It became like a cult. It became a cult of people who were ditto heads, ditto to whatever Rush Limbaugh said. And that has magnified. So today, that was a forerunner of Sean Hannity. It's a forerunner of a lot of the people. Bill O'Reilly for a while until he had to step aside. And
Yeah.
so, Charlie, can I add one thing here?
Sure.
So, uh, Bill O'Reilly was one of my students when I taught at Harvard.
Really?
And he was not this way at all. He was just a guy who was trying to get famous, and he was trying to find a niche to use. What niche can I make my own? And he did this. And I was on a conservative talk show one time, and the host, a woman, I'm not going to call her out specifically, but let's say one of the better known uh, female conservative talk people. I was on her show because I had attacked Rush Limbaugh, so she invited me on the program to kind of debate me on it. And during a commercial, she said, "Oh, come on, Mickey, it's just entertainment, right?"
Oof.
And I said, "Yeah, but your audience doesn't know it's just entertainment." And that was so there's also a cynicism here.
Yeah.
Rush Limbaugh became very, very wealthy doing this. And so there are a lot of people who have just played into the nastier instincts of the populace in order to
You,
make
you,
themselves wealthy.
I was a talk show host for more than 20 years,
I
and
know you were.
I always push back against people who say, "Well, you just say this because this is what you have to say, or because you're trying to be entertaining." By the way, I didn't mind being entertaining if on occasion. I mean, I didn't think it was a bad thing, but I'd say no. I think that most people believe. I believe what I'm saying. I believe most of them believe what they're saying. I know, but I no longer think so. Now I think you are seeing over and over again this deep cynicism, the way in which the business model is driving it. And the story you just told about they take the camera goes off, they take the microphone off, and they go, "Oh man, now I need to take a bath or I need to take a shower." See, that's been one of the real turns. So you wrote a book, Reclaiming Conservatism in 2000. It was published in 2008. So
Right.
you saw that you say you should have seen it coming, but you didn't. But actually, you did. You saw it coming about a decade before I did. So what was it that made you write that in 2008? What was your point where you looked around and said, "What the hell's going on here? What's going on with my fellow Republicans?"
Well, it was the dominance of the social and cultural issues.
Mhm.
And I had actually gone back in that book. I went back to every Republican National Convention platform since I think I started in 1974 or 76 and traced how it had changed every 4 years and was now talking about different issues. Um, so I had seen that, but that was even then. So I didn't really see it. I'd like to take credit, and I thank you,
Mhm.
but what I didn't see, and I don't think I would have predicted the rise of a single individual who would have everybody fall in line the way
No.
people have fallen in line behind Trump. Because when I was in the House and I was in the Republican leadership and chairman of the policy committee, and we've already talked about, I was very close to Ronald Reagan. I was with him in the hotel room in New Hampshire when he won that primary. I called him at his home in California to get into his campaign in the first place. So I was close to him. And yet, as one of the Republican leaders when he was president, I voted against him a lot. There were many times I spoke on the floor against what he was proposing, and I did it with George H.W. Bush too.
And you were not excommunicated.
Of course,
It was not perceived as a form of heresy where your local party would then censure you for speaking out
no,
against them.
not at all. I mean, you were expected to do that. There were a lot of conservatives who on some things did not support what either Reagan did or later what Bush did, and we were very open about it. And Reagan's response would be, "Well, I have to sit down with you guys, and we have to talk about it and see if we can negotiate, or okay, I'll have to change on this." I met with Reagan one time because people in his administration were trying to cut funding for education, for higher education, and I had a problem with that. And so I went around the Department of Education, went around the budget director, and went directly to Reagan and got him to change it. Well, today that wouldn't work. I mean, today it's a cult around one person, and whatever he says goes.
So on this theme of should have seen it coming, there are folks on the left who will be listening to this conversation and go, "Well, of course you should have seen it coming because the Republican Party, the conservative movement, was always a fascist movement. You were always racist. Go back. There's a straight line from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is just saying out loud the things that all of you Reagan Republicans really believed back in 1980. Now, I completely disagree with that, but I wanted to just to tee that up for you. I mean, because you've heard this, right? It's that is that really Donald Trump is nothing more than the logical development of everything we've been talking about, and that we were blind to see that, but we were part of it. We built everything that led to Ronald Reagan. I mean, sorry, that led to Donald Trump.
Right. Well, I worry sometimes when I'm teaching in Princeton now, but I used to also teach here a number of years ago. And Paul Krugman and I, we spoke together on a panel. His office was down the hall from mine. We had the same course assistant, and so I don't wish him ill. And yet. I think if Krugman were to write, I worry that someday he's going to find some kind of a column he can write about something, any topic, a World Series or something, where he doesn't include an attack on Ronald Reagan. And so
It could happen.
it's just, I think there are people on the left who think, well, yeah, who have and this, by the way, hurts people like you and me, because they hated Reagan. They thought Reagan was evil. They thought Bush was evil. They think, and W was evil. And so after a while, people who are conservatives start to tune that out, and they say, because they hate all of us anyway. They think we're all crazy. They think all of that, and it fuels the anti-left part of this. Well, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of the left that is good, that where we can find common ground. But what happens is, with this constant demonization of people who have a different point of view, at a point people just say, no, that's my enemy, and I think it hurts us.
Yeah, this is something that I have I've mentioned over the years, that it is the crying wolf syndrome. That if you call every conservative a racist and a fascist, when the real thing comes along, people will just simply roll their eyes and shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, you've been saying this forever. You've been saying that every conservative is dumb and racist and fascist." And if you're not willing to distinguish this, then maybe we shouldn't listen to you. The other thing is, what's interesting about it is that
Charlie, let me just say,
yeah.
I think to some extent it's becoming true.
Well, that's the problem. And now this is what's hard is that it becomes harder to defend as you watch the Republicans get into lockstep behind this, as you see them refuse to deal with white nationalism, as you see them refuse to stand up for democratic norms. You do have to wonder, did they change, or were they always like this? So let me just throw that out. I mean, did these, you've known these people. One of the things that I thought after watching CPAC again, and I'm sure this thought's crossed your mind, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, was like, how was I ever in the room with these people? How did I ever think that we had something in common? Why was I ever allied to these people? But it comes back to that question, were they always like this or have they changed?
Um, I can tell you that the years when I was running CPAC, there were some people like that, but there were very, very few. They were a very tiny number, and not at all representative of the conservative. The people who were like that were not representative of the bigger number of people in the conservative movement, but they were always there. There were always some.
Sure.
So I guess what's happened is that, with the rise of Gingrich and Limbaugh and other forces like that, it magnified the number. And although did you notice that the poll that was just taken at CPAC about who people there preferred to have as the Republican
I
nominee
did.
in 4 years, I think what Trump got like 55% and 45% wanted somebody else. It's not that the people they wanted were any better, but so I think maybe there's some hope that people are not going to just blindly you know be part of this cult in the
Well,
future.
maybe, but on this question of were they the same or have they changed? I think that there people always have the better angels and the worst. They can go in different directions depending on their leadership. And one of the things that changed is that there were always the people out there on the fringes who would go too far, but then you would have the vital center in the Republican Party that would push back against them. Ronald Reagan would stand up and denounce bigotry. Bob Dole denounced bigotry. The Bushes would push back against racism or any of those things. So there would be voices that would say, you can't go there. William F. Buckley famously expels the John Birch Society and the Ku Klux Klan. What's different now is there's no one who's willing to do that. Not just that they don't do it and it fails. There's just a complete unwillingness. So for example, you and I could argue for 20, 30 years that no, the conservatives are not racist, but clearly there's a willingness among conservatives now to tolerate racism, an unwillingness to confront it. And I think that's, believe it or not, that's a real step backwards, I think, from where we might have been 20 years ago.
Well, I think it is. But one of the things that, you take Joe Biden's stimulus package, which is pretty popular across the country with Republicans as well as Democrats. And so one of the things that has happened uh, years ago when the Tea Party rose to power, and people like Dick Armey, uh, I think I wasn't there, but figured out that you don't really need to win a the general election because so many congressional districts now are either Republican or Democrat
Yeah.
overwhelmingly. Well, all you have to do is win the primary. And so now you have all these people. I'm convinced that there are a lot of people who voted to uh, uh, not convict Donald
Yeah.
Trump, who voted to challenge the results of the elections. I don't think they all believe that. They're terrified of losing their primary. And our political party system, the way it is set up, it doesn't
Yeah.
really matter whether the majority of people are for you. It's just whether the majority of the people who show up on election day in a primary, which is a much smaller number, are for you or not. And so you got a lot of people here who I think I'm hoping maybe I'm being hopeful here, but I think a lot of the members of Congress who've been going along with this stuff don't really believe it, but they're terrified. They're terrified of losing in a primary. So in that case, what you need is not just less racism, less bigotry, but you also need more courage. You need,
We're not seeing a lot of that. Actually, this seems to be the one thing that's motivating Republicans right now, besides the Dr. Seuss culture war stuff, is finding ways to restrict access to the ballot box. And
right.
again, it's they seem to have internalized the idea that they are better off the fewer people that vote, and that they no longer need to persuade new people. They just need to protect their base, and that they can hold on to power as a minority party. So, this is one of the, I mean, there's two elements that are disturbing about the number of Republicans that believe the big lie about the 2020 election, that it was stolen. Number one, that's a big lie. Number two is they're using this as an excuse to restrict access to the ballot box, which is, again, something that is kind of breathtaking to watch, the way the party has lined up behind voter restriction as kind of the emotional core of what they're doing right now.
Well, Charlie, maybe you've run into this too, but over the years, I have so many times heard these debates where a a Democrat, a liberal, would talk about the American democracy, and a conservative would say, "We're not a democracy; we're a
Yes.
republic." And then the liberal would say, "No, we're a democracy." And of course, the truth is, we're both.
Yeah.
You know, uh, and there is this fight now because I think people on the right have been for so long pushing back against democracy. Well, the founders were not great champions of democracy. They wanted to constrain the power of the majority, and within limits that the Constitution created. Um, so there has been this strain all along of yeah, we want to. We want to make sure that the masses are not able to take us off in some socialist communist direction, and that's not new. I think that's
Actually, that's a really good point. That the anti-majoritarianism has been something that's been around in the conservative movement for some time. I guess I was also disturbed by the fact that they're not only anti-democratic, but when it came to just preserving basic, constitution, the norms of a constitutional republic, which in theory they preferred over democracy, they also weren't willing to defend that either, are they?
well. I think that's true, but I also, again, so I mean, I've been pretty clear as you are about our disdain for what now is the conservative movement. But I have to say, I mean, watched AOC the other, on TV, saying, well, we should just override the Senate parliamentarian. First it was, go to the rescission so that you change the rules to do it this way, and then if the rules say now you can't do that, well then just override it. There was talk about if Biden won, it would pack the Supreme Court. There was all so
Right.
the left has kind of given up on the norms of liberal democracy too, and so I think what we were seeing is that on the left and the right both, people just want the outcome they want. They want the policies they want, and they don't really care about the Constitution. They don't care about process. Democracy is about process. It's not about outcome. But
and
no,
that's boring
yeah,
compared to outcomes, right? You
well,
can get people's blood fired up with the outcome. Talking about process requires, years of habits and the development of respect for those habits. And I worry about spiraling radicalization, that as each side becomes more focused on just winning,
right,
regardless of the process, that the other side will say, well, look what they do. Why can't we play
exactly.
by those rules? And we're seeing that right now, that every violation of norms then invites the other side to also violate the norm.
Well, when Harry Reid did that with the filibuster,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, did he ever stop to think someday Mitch McConnell might be the leader in the Senate? I remember the debates when I was in the House, And Reagan and Bush, supported the line item veto, which I was totally against because it goes completely against the intent of the Constitution, and I would oppose it. And I would be saying, does it ever occur to you guys someday there may be a Democrat in the White House? And the Democrat will use the line item veto against what you want. But that sort of thinking is gone. Both sides now just want whatever they have to do to get the outcome they want. I will say I'm pleased that Joe Biden is in the White House because he has an instinct to follow the procedural norms, and that's why he was able on the $15 minimum wage, which I think is way overdue, and we should have it. But he basically said, okay, we'll maybe have to bring that up in a separate kind of bill. Maybe we can't do it in this bill, and that's a strange thing. But I think Biden's got the right instincts.
Well, I agree with you. I worry, however, that he's kind of a throwback in that respect. That maybe he's sort of a parenthesis in the long going in the ongoing radicalization of the process. That once his generation, the people who have that historical memory, are gone, that it's going to be just whatever it takes to win. Because as you point out, I mean, the question that everyone should always ask when they're about to change the rules is how we feel about this when the other side is in the majority, because the other side will always at some point get back into the majority, especially right now with everything so evenly divided. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to imagine, well, if you change the rules of the Senate now to get this piece of legislation through, how will you feel in 2023 if, in fact, it is Mitch McConnell who is deciding what the rules of the Senate are going to be? And again, this is not a huge leap of imagination to think that through, and yet people seem to be increasingly unwilling to do that.
Yeah, and one of the great examples of that has been the use of executive orders going around Congress, and what you think the other party isn't going to use executive orders when they get the White House. So I despair. It's not only what happened to the Republican Party, which is really disgraceful, and the conservative movement, which I don't recognize and don't want to be affiliated with, but what's happened to a belief in constitutional norms, in just the democratic process, the deliberative process, the system that the founders set up. And they did a lot of things wrong, obviously, but the system they set up for the actual management of government, with a democratic system for electing who was going to hold office, and a Republican system with the constraints and rules. Not very many. You and I, Charlie, may be the last two people who believe in it.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking as you were saying that in theory, if somebody said, that all of these norms are very, very fragile, that, 20, 30 years ago, we all would have said, well, yes, we know that. But that was only theoretical. We didn't really know that. Now we really know how fragile and thin some of these things are. Mickey Edwards, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today.
Yeah, Charlie, thanks. Great to talk to you.
I appreciate it. Check out Mickey Edwards' pieces in the Bulwark, including Mugged by Reality this week. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. We'll be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.